Hello, I'm William Michael of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, and in this video, I'd like to talk a little bit about the troubling situation that we're seeing among children with regard to talk about suicide, even attempts at suicide. For parents, and I'm talking about these things as a teacher, as one who works with parents and with children, and hears about troubles that children are having. And I don't believe I've had a parent in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy ever talk to me about this, but I have known of other Catholic families who have either spoken of these problems or contacted us to talk about them. But it seems like, from what I see, even in reports online, it seems that these things are becoming more commonplace. And this materialistic modern medical community has no answer for these things because they're mysterious and dark. We can pretend that there's some kind of psychological disorder that needs to be improved by therapy, but we can't experiment with our children's souls. I really don't want to learn if something works or doesn't work in the life of my own child. And so I'm concerned that this materialistic modern medicine is leading many people, parents, when they face these problems, to turn to materialistic solutions that are not going to work. And these children who obviously have something wrong are just going to be experimented with by things that are really uncertain, to say the least, if not, outright crazy to even attempt to start giving children drugs, for example, that change the way their minds work and start tinkering with things that are so far beyond our understanding that we're just really experimenting and playing with people's souls. And then to watch these experiments go wrong and things turn out far worse than they were to begin with. And then just to say, oh, well, that's what the doctor said, or that's what the advice was, is just irresponsible. As Christians, we have to ask the question whether or not these experiences have their source in spiritual causes, and whether there's any way for us to understand these things and remedy them by spiritual means. When I look at Catholic people in the modern world, I wonder what the point of being Catholic even is when it appears to have so little to do with the actual problems that we experience in this life. It seems that all of the problems that we experience can either be solved by government or medicine. If that's true, what's even the point of having religion? I really don't understand what people think when they claim to be religious and then imagine that every problem in their life must have some human or material remedy. It makes no sense. I don't think we really understand the nature of the Christian faith and what this life is about, what the causes of our troubles are, and what the remedy for them actually is. So what I'd like to do, thinking about this question of suicide and depression and these dark issues that so many people seem to be dealing with. When I was a child, I don't remember hearing people talk about depression. I don't remember anyone talking about these things. I never talked about these things. I never thought about killing myself or, struggled with the darkness of depression that we see in people. And we have to ask, whether there's some spiritual understanding that's needed here. And I'd like to talk about a few stories from sacred scripture that I think can help us. And again, the sacred scripture is not just some storybook for children to provide some interesting content for bedtime stories or Sunday school classes. These are real historical events. These are real people. These events that took place are described historically and as real events. And in the book of Romans, St. Paul tells us that whatever is written beforehand in the scriptures was written for our benefit, that through the comfort of the scriptures we might have hope. And you can see that the scriptures are intended to be a source of hope, a divinely inspired source of hope. And as we move away from scripture and away from religion, it's no mystery why we seem to have this trouble in modern society with depression, which is simply a lack or loss of hope. So I'd like to talk about a couple of stories that I think shed some light on these problems, and I'd like us to see that the scriptures actually address these things if we would give them attention and stop looking for modern human materialistic remedies for the problems that we have, as if our religion has no real purpose. The first biblical story that I'd like to talk about is the life of Job. And I assume that most Catholics aren't familiar with the details of the story of Job. And this is a historical account of the life of Job. It's given to us as one of the earliest books of the Bible, one of the first books historically of the Old Testament, to reveal to us truth that the ignorance of can lead us to be miserable in this life. God reveals to us truth in the book of Job that allows us to understand what is going on around us and teaches us how to deal with adversity, how to deal with misfortunes and even tragedies in this life. We have to understand these things, or we're simply going to falsely interpret the things we experience. And then when we falsely interpret them or falsely diagnose them, we're then going to seek remedies that are not going to help us. And we can't allow that to happen. So let's start by meditating a little on the life of Job in the Old Testament. In this book of Job, we learn about a man, an old, wise, righteous man who lived in the ancient world. His name was Job. And it's really important for us to understand he was a wise, virtuous, righteous, wealthy man who was respected all throughout the area where he lived. Everyone knew he was a great man, had everything. I think he had 10 children. Just like me, he had 7 sons and 3 daughters. He was wealthy. He was known for his righteousness. He was known as one who helped the poor and did works of mercy. And his life, in every way imaginable, was blessed and happy. However, in the book of Job, we're told of an event that takes place in the presence of God, among the angels. We're told in the book of Job, and this is divine revelation, there's no way for human beings to know this or understand this unless God reveals it to us, and he does. We're told in the book of Job that one day the devil came to God and he made an accusation against Job, because that's what the devil does. He makes accusations against us before God and argues with God that we don't actually love him and that we deserve to be punished. Satan stood before God and he told God that the only reason that Job is good and praises God or worships God, the only reason is because his life is blessed materially and physically. That's the only reason why he blesses God. And Satan accuses Job of this conditional love and adoration for God. And Satan tells God that if God would take away some of this prosperity from the life of Job, that Job would actually curse God. And he makes this accusation. And so God chooses to permit Satan to unleash a number of different attacks on Job to prove or to test Job's faithfulness, that it's not conditional, that it's actually true and unconditional. And so God gives the devil permission to attack Job. And the attack is really incredible. What the devil does to Job is horrific. First of all, the devil causes Job to lose all of his possessions, all of his livestock. Wealth was primarily measured in livestock in an ancient agrarian society, and the devil causes Job to lose all of his livestock. All of his wealth is taken from him. But even worse than that, the devil attacks Job's children. And I want us to see this, that the Bible teaches us this. The devil attacks Job's children in this story. So here's Job. He is a faithful man seeking to obey and follow God for his own salvation. And the devil attacks his children. Doesn't attack him directly, attacks his children and kills them all. Causes them all to die in this tragic event. There's a storm and the house that they're in is destroyed and they all die in this natural disaster. The Bible teaches us that the devil attacks the children of a righteous man. And then finally, the devil is given permission by God to attack Job himself physically. And Job breaks out in some horrible disease so that his body is covered with painful sores and he's living in this, miserable state of life as this old man suddenly overwhelmed with a terrible disease. And so at this point in his life, after the devil unleashes these attacks, which remember are permitted by God, the devil unleashes these attacks, destroys and takes away all of Job's wealth, kills Job's children, and attacks Job physically with disease. Job is left in the midst of this horrific trial. He's left to try and figure out what's going on. And he's left in this darkness that all of us experience, this uncertainty, trying to interpret and understand the events in his life. And you can imagine the events that he has to interpret are dark and painful. He's lost all of his wealth inexplicably. He's lost the lives of his children. And he's lost his own physical health. He's lost everything. And you can imagine him sitting there wondering, what is the purpose of my religion? Where is God? How can I be allowed to suffer these things when I've devoted my entire life to virtue? And the point of the book of Job is to show us that these evils that Job experiences have no cause in him, that there's no cause even in the natural world itself. There's no cause. His disease has no natural cause. The loss of his children had no cause in him. It wasn't because of his irresponsible parenting or their education wasn't sufficient or anything. And the loss of his wealth wasn't caused by some bad business decision he made or because he was covetous and greedy. All of the losses that he suffered, horrifically painful losses, had no cause in him. There was nothing that he did to cause them. There was nothing that he could do to remedy them. What he was experiencing was a spiritual trial. It was pursued by the devil. It was caused in every way by the devil and permitted by God. And so Job is left in this darkness to process these events and try and figure out what to do. Put yourself in his shoes. What should I do? What am I supposed to do? And what we find Job does is he simply sits there, silent, and he thinks. He thinks through the situation, one piece at a time, like unraveling all of the knots in a giant ball of yarn that's all been tangled and twisted and turned into a mess. He just starts pulling out the knots one by one, thinking through the whole situation in patience. And this is why we refer to the patience of Job as an extraordinary virtue. But he begins just unraveling this mess in his mind, in his own quiet meditation. What's interesting to see is that the people around Job cause him more grief. His wife mocks his religion. His wife actually says to him, "Curse God and die," mocking him in his misery. That's his wife. And the stress that's added to his troubles by this evil woman. His so-called friends come to him and they're amazed by his condition. Their conclusion is that he must have done something wrong to merit these calamities. There's no way that God would have let these things happen to a good man. There must be some cause in Job. And so his friends start to question him and challenge him to confess what secret evil he's been hiding that has been exposed by these misfortunes. And Job argues with them and refuses to listen to their suggestions and says, no, these ideas are not true. There is no justification for these evils in anything that I have done. I can say before God that I have a good conscience, and there's no explanation that these experiences in my life can in any way be just. And so Job has to fight off and resist the false arguments of his wife and friends, of his closest relatives and friends. And he's left there to deal with these problems, to deal with this dark providence alone. And in the story of the book, he does so. He bears with it alone. He continues to reason through the details. He continues to maintain his faith in God. And one of the lines that he says, which is really beautiful, you've probably heard one of them. He says, "I came into this world naked, and I'm going to leave this world naked. And therefore, the changes of this life can't possibly change my thoughts about God, because I'm going to die with nothing. So how could I curse God because I've lost something that I can't take with me in the end anyway? So that saying, we've brought nothing into this world and we can take nothing out, that comes from Job. And secondly, he says, even if God should kill me, I would trust him. Even if he would slay me, he says, yet would I trust him. And so we see in the person of Job this persevering trust in God, even in the face of the most horrific and inexplicable experiences. And many of us, in lesser degrees, have gone through those times and continue to experience those times. And what God reveals to us is that those events are not necessarily in any way our fault. We may be attacked by the malice of the devil, and I know this kind of talk isn't popular today in a society full of depressed, suicidal people, but maybe that's why. God reveals to us that there is more to our experiences than any kind of human accounting for evils committed. It's not just a matter of human justice being carried out, not karma. And it's also not necessarily physical or natural. It's not just chemical reactions taking place or being attacked by viruses and bacteria. There's more to this life than what we can perceive through the senses or understand with our own observation and even with our own reasoning. There's more to this life than meets the eye. The book of Job is given to us to reveal that to us, that there's more to this life than these simple, human, materialistic explanations for the things that we see around us. Job's experiences were terrible, and they weren't all centered in his own person. They didn't all target him directly. His children were attacked and killed in this situation. But we see the devil is permitted by God to attack Job's children. And that should frighten us a bit. I want to share another story. This one is from the New Testament. This is from the Gospel of Mark in chapter 9. The Gospel of St. Mark, chapter 9. Let's see where I should begin. Jesus, in Mark chapter 9, enters this place, and we read beginning in verse 16. One of the multitude, one of the crowd, a member from the crowd, came forward to Jesus and says this, and listen, Master, I have brought my son to thee. I have brought my son to thee, having a dumb spirit. Now listen, this child is under the influence of an evil spirit. Child. And listen to the details. Wheresoever he taketh him, that is, wheresoever the spirit takes the child, wheresoever he taketh him, he dasheth him, and he foameth, and gnashes with his teeth, and pines away. I spoke to your disciples to cast him out, but they could not. So here we find a man who has a child being attacked by an evil spirit, under the influence of an evil spirit. This man brings his child to the apostles, and they can't help him. Jesus then says this mysterious word, he says, "O incredulous generation." Incredulous means unbelieving. "O unbelieving generation, how long shall I be with you? How long shall I suffer you? Bring him unto me. Bring him unto me." He criticizes them for their unbelief. He says, "O incredulous." He doesn't say, "O incredulous man." He says, "O incredulous generation." That is, it was a generation of people that did not believe. Bring the child to me. And they brought him. And when he had seen him, immediately the spirit troubled him. And being thrown down upon the ground, he rolled about, foaming. So this spirit attacks this child in the presence of Jesus and in front of the crowd. Jesus then asks the Father, "How long is it since this hath happened to him? How long has this been going on?" And the Father said, and listen to this, the Father said, "From his infancy." From his infancy. How long has this been going on? How long has this spirit been taking him, dashing him, causing him to foam and gnash with his teeth? How long has this been going on? The Father says, "From his infancy." And listen, "Often he hath cast him into fire." The Spirit hath oftentimes cast my Son into fire and into water to destroy him. This Spirit has tried to kill my Son. He's cast him into fire. He's cast him into water to destroy him. Now let's just stop there and imagine this man and this child living in their community. Imagine the neighbors seeing this man and his son. Imagine the gossip stories going around about this child. This kid is what? This kid is suicidal. This kid is depressed. Look at him pining away. This kid is miserable, trying to kill himself. Imagine the embarrassment his father has to deal with. I mean, it's not flattering for a parent to have his child talking about killing himself. It makes it appear that the father is some kind of horrible person, or that the child's life provided for him is miserable. It's embarrassing for a parent to have to deal with these problems. And yet everyone looking on from the outside, they see a boy, a crazy kid, evil, weirdo, trying to kill himself. Imagine the stories. He jumped into the fire. He tried to drown himself in water. But the father, thankfully, the father understood that it wasn't the boy. It wasn't the boy doing these things. It wasn't some chemical imbalance in the boy messing up with his brain. It wasn't some material mental health disorder. This boy was being attacked by an evil spirit that was physically and really attacking him and trying to destroy him. But in God's providence, the devil, this evil spirit, wasn't allowed to succeed in destroying this boy. And so this father finally brings this boy to the disciples of Jesus, and imagine, brings them, and they can do nothing. So what does he do? He brings this boy to Jesus himself. Jesus asks, "How long has this been going on?" And the man says, "From his infancy." And he finally asks Jesus, "If you can do anything, have compassion on us. Have compassion on us. If you can do anything, have compassion on us." You can imagine this man and this boy haven't seen much compassion. But he asks Jesus to have compassion, and if he can, to do anything for him and his son. Jesus says to this man, it's not a question, and I'm adding this here. This is not in the scripture, but Jesus basically says, look, this isn't a question of what I can do. This isn't a question of what God can do. He says to the man, if you can believe, if you, not if me, if you can believe, all things are possible to him who believes. It's not if I can, it's if you can. If you can believe, all things are possible to him who believes. And immediately the father of the boy cried out, and listen to this beautiful cry. The father says, "I do believe. I do believe." But then he says, "Help my unbelief. I do believe. I know that my belief may not be perfect. Therefore, help my unbelief. I do believe, Lord." And it said, he cried out with tears. I do believe. Help my unbelief. And when Jesus saw the multitude coming together, he threatened the evil spirit and said to him, "Deaf and dumb spirit, I command you, go out of him and enter not any more into him." And crying out and greatly tearing him, he went out of him, and the boy became as dead. And many said, "The boy is dead." But Jesus, taking him by the hand, lifted him up, and he arose. The boy's problem was not that he was merely suicidal or had some mental health trouble. This boy was being attacked by an evil spirit that was trying to destroy him. And the remedy was prayer. That was the remedy. Bringing the child before God and begging God to help him. The remedy for this boy's life and all of the trouble in this boy's life, which he had suffered from his infancy, the remedy was prayer. And then after this, remember the disciples, however, even though they were given power to cast out evil spirits, they had no ability to deal with this spirit. They asked him, "Why could we not cast him out? Why could we not help this boy? Why did it seem that we had no power?" And I'm sure you've experienced that. I'm sure you've said, "Well, I did pray. nothing happened? Why could we not cast him out? And listen what Jesus says. This kind of spirit can go out by nothing but by prayer and fasting. This kind can go out by nothing but by prayer and fasting. So this boy's whole life, this boy lived in torment. This boy appeared to be suicidal from his infancy. And the only remedy for this boy's life, there was no doctor who could help him, no psychology, no therapy could help him. He didn't just have to have positive thoughts. The only thing that could help him was prayer. And not just any prayer, but a certain, we could say intensity of prayer, a certain sincerity of prayer, prayer that came from a believing intercessor, prayer that came with fasting. This kind can go out by nothing but by prayer and fasting. And so in these two stories, I want you to see in both stories good men, men who are in no way responsible for their unhappy experiences. Good men were suffering from attacks, not on themselves, but on their children. And they were going through these terrible circumstances. In Job's case, his sons being killed. In this other man's case, this boy being thrown into fire and having a spirit dwelling in him, controlling his life, trying to destroy him at every turn. The cause of these problems was not in the boy. The cause of these problems was not in nature. The cause of these problems was not in the parents or in the boy's education or anything else. This was a spiritual attack that required a spiritual remedy. And as we listen to all of this talk in our society, we're not merely hearing about kids being thrown into the fire or thrown into waters. We're hearing about kids going through with the deeds and killing themselves. These spirits are succeeding in destroying these children by all kinds of different means, by ridiculous means. I told you, the story that I recently heard was about a 10-year-old boy. We're talking about a good-looking kid. This isn't some, social outcast oddball. This is a good-looking kid who I think his sister found him hung in his room by his sweatshirt. This situation is increasingly dark and horrifying. I have never had to deal with any of this kind of talk among my children. We've been blessed like Job. We've been blessed with perfect health, and I've never had to deal with a depressed child. I have, and I've talked about this in the past, we have had to deal with my wife dealing with some of these kinds of problems. I talked about it in a recent talk I did called How the Devil Steals Our Vocations or something like that. You can look that up. But my wife has struggled with this a bit, and I think I know the causes of the struggles that my wife experiences, and I talked about them. But in my children, we've never had an experience like this except once. When my eldest daughter was 3 years old, I was at work teaching in a private school. My wife was home I think we had 3 kids at the time. And my daughter was 3 years old, and she had a seizure out of nowhere. She had a seizure. And you can read about seizures, and kids have seizures, and it's quite common. But my daughter had a seizure that lasted for hours and hours, and the first responders and even the doctors in the hospital couldn't get it to stop. They basically saw it as a life and death situation and administered every possible drug that they could to get it to stop. And they told us very plainly, this is a completely extraordinary situation. It's very likely that she's going to have permanent brain damage and never recover from this. This is, her life was spared, but when she comes back to her senses after all of these drugs wear off, she may be handicapped for the rest of her life, and she was a perfectly healthy 3-year-old girl. And we knew in that experience, we knew there was something going on more than just a kid having a seizure. Not that any seizure is a minor, but this was really eerie and dark. And I remember having to deal with that situation as a father and feeling like this man in the Gospels. And it was a point in my life where, as a father, I realized that the devil and all kinds of evil, while I feel strong in faith and hope to resist a lot of these kinds of attacks and temptations, I never thought about the devil attacking my children. And I remember that experience scaring the life out of me, thinking, what if the devil chooses to attack me by attacking my children? I'm not prepared for anything like that. I'm not afraid of dying. I'm not afraid of suffering. But the thought of my children suffering was terrifying to me. And that was actually part of that experience, and those thoughts were part of what led me to enter the Catholic Church. I knew that there was more to this life than I was prepared for, and I didn't feel equipped to deal with it. And I knew that I needed more spiritual power, if you will, and that power was available in the Catholic Church, the only place that even pretended to be able to deal with that kind of stuff. So I had an experience like that, but outside of that, I've never had to deal with any depression or suicidal talk among my kids. And I can't imagine how dark and painful that is for parents, how scary it is for parents. I can't imagine going to bed at night and having to think about, whether the kids are all safe or whether, that kid who's out tonight or who didn't come home tonight is even alive. I can't imagine living like that, and I can see why that father with that son was simply asking for compassion, because it's a terrible burden to bear. And yet what I want to point out is that these experiences that we hear people talking about, they're talked about in Scripture. There are stories in sacred Scripture that describe these things to the letter. And if you've had experiences like these, if you've had experiences where children seemed to be attacked, that there was no explanation for these things, that it just seemed to be some kind of dark spiritual experience, you need to know that the Scriptures support that interpretation of those experiences. They tell us explicitly that these things are caused and can have a spiritual cause and can only have a spiritual remedy. And so we're not crazy to think that what our children are experiencing is not some simple natural effect of not having enough education, their parents not being perfect, watching a bad movie, playing a video game, listening to a song. No, there's not necessarily some human cause. There's not necessarily some natural cause. The cause may be entirely spiritual and the remedy entirely spiritual. But if you've had to deal with these things, and I know people have, I know people listening to this have because they've talked to us about it. If you've had to deal with these things, tell me the Gospels don't describe your situation exactly. Tell me you don't feel like Job. Tell me you can't imagine yourself in Job's situation, and that's what you live in fear of every day. And see these dark situations addressed by our religion, and see the remedy taught to us. If you believe, anything is possible for him who believes. This kind can go out only by prayer and fasting. You're not called to, bump up your health insurance plan or see your physician or, take the sugar out of the kid's diet. You're told that you need to pursue these things and understand that spiritual warfare extends to the body and our natural possessions, material possessions as well. There's no division between spiritual things and material things. They're all interrelated. They're all one. And Scripture teaches us these things. Why? Like I said before, anything that was written before in the Scriptures were written for us, for our instruction, so that by the comfort of the Scriptures we may have hope. And the Scriptures that I've read, sure, they show us that our experiences are dark and we wish they didn't exist. They show us that God even allows these things to exist, and that's the only reason why they can even happen. But they also show us what the real cause is, that it's not God. God is not the cause. It's not us. We're not necessarily the cause. But the cause is the evil one, and it's a spiritual battle, and it's to be fought with spiritual weapons, spiritual methods. And so the Scriptures comfort us by taking away the greatest fears we have, fears that it's our fault, that we've done something wrong, and there's like some hidden thing in our life that's causing these evil experiences. That's the worst fear. That's a source of anxiety, or that it's our responsibility to find some natural cause for these things. The Scriptures comfort us and teach us that it's not necessarily so. And they give us hope because they urge us to believe. They urge us to pray and to fast and to fight fire with fire, to fight spiritual attacks with spiritual weapons. And that gives us hope. So I hope you find that comforting, and I hope that you feel that it does give you some hope, that you have to fight these things, and you have to fight them by spiritual means, believing that all things are possible with God, by praying, by fasting, and by taking up this battle, and realizing that the devil certainly may attack your children, even from infancy, by God's permission. And it's for you and us together to fight against those evil spiritual influences and overcome them by good. That's comforting and a source of hope. So that's what I wanted to talk about. I hate hearing these stories in the news. It's so dark and heavy for me to hear about these kids struggling like this and going through these terrible experiences, but it hurts me and grieves me even more to watch as this society, which doesn't believe, this incredulous generation, puffs itself up and just turns more arrogantly than before to these materialistic, natural, and human remedies that again and again prove to be insufficient for these things. That's even more grievous, to watch people go back to this ineffective philosophy of life, this miserable philosophy of life that not only leaves us with these terrible things to bear, but deceives us about how we're to bear with them, and rather than comforts us, rather than give us any hope, simply scolds us like Job's wife and friends, and accuses us of not making use of the means, not paying more, not seeking more expert consultation, which we get billed for by the thousands of dollars, and it never accomplishes anything. We're scolded and ridiculed by this incredulous, materialistic generation, and the cause of the problem and the remedy of that problem are unknown to those people who are scolding us and mocking us when we consider that there might be some religious issue at hand. Scripture tells us there most certainly is. And so we have to learn to deal with these things as Christians, and again, not relegate Christianity, not relegate this religion, not relegate it to some kind of, comfort when somebody's dying, or some Sunday school entertainment for little children, but to realize that the Scriptures deal with all of these things plainly and clearly, and we're simply not listening to them. And the darkness around us is getting worse and worse, and it's no surprise that the problem in this boy's experience in the gospel was that he lived in the presence of an incredulous generation. And it was only the prayer, the tears of his father that saved his life. So let's learn a lesson from the Scriptures and not allow ourselves to be caught up in this modern materialistic thinking about human life. We're creatures composed of body and soul, inseparable, made in the image and likeness of God. What goes on in our souls affects our bodies. What we see in our bodies relates to our souls. Anything that can affect our soul can affect our body. And we have to learn to look at human problems according to human nature, according to divine revelation, and not according to this modern, naturalistic, mechanical, materialistic, scientific worldview found in this incredulous and unbelieving generation. I'd like you to know that if you'd like to talk about these things, I'm happy to talk about them. I think you'll find in me compassion, first of all, because as you can see, I don't believe that these are merely problems caused by bad kids or bad parents, or that God is angry at you and that's why you have to go through these things. I know that you can be perfectly clean, perfectly innocent, and be suffering these horrible situations. And I'm not like one of Job's friends who's going to judge and try to point out faults in you that cause these problems, or try to sell you something as if I have the remedy for your problems. I've shown you what the remedies are, and I know that you may need encouragement, and you may need someone just to talk to like Job, how Job just slowly worked through all of those knots in his situation. And if you'd like someone to talk to like that, I welcome you to get in touch, and I'd be happy to talk about your circumstances. But I also encourage you to make use of the sacraments. There's a well-known priest who's got videos and things on the internet named Father Ripperger. And he's popular because he's an exorcist, and he talks about all kinds of situations with demonic activity and spiritual warfare. And people get all riled up about that stuff because they want to, they want to experience some kind of like Gandalf-like wizard warfare. They're looking to be entertained, but this priest, what he explains is that this spiritual warfare is real. Demonic activity and influences are real. But the most powerful weapons against them, not some hocus-pocus fancy remedy, not some magic prayer or silver bullet that you need to learn about. But what he explains in his talks, which most people seem to ignore, is that the graces that Christ made available to us in the church, the sacred scriptures, the authority of the church, the 7 sacraments, sacramentals, and so on, these are the weapons of this spiritual warfare. These are the weapons, and this is the battle that these things were given to us to fight against. And so we have to learn to give more respect to the Catholic faith, to practice it more thoughtfully with study and more attention and devotion. And we have to realize that these problems that fill our lives are not just a bunch of medical conditions. They're not caused by our failures as parents. We're living in the presence of constant spiritual troubles, and the remedies for these things are given to us in the Catholic Church, and we have to use them. And if we don't, we're going to be exposed, and we're going to have no excuse, because the remedies were given to us to keep us safe, and we simply neglected them. And we have to make sure that that's not happening. So there is some cause for concern among parents. But it's not that you need to find some magic root somewhere in South America, or you need to, get a bottle of air from, outer space to save your child's life. The problem is that we may just be neglecting to practice the Catholic faith as we should be practicing it, and consequently, we're subjecting ourselves to attacks and troubles that we could remedy by living a faithful Catholic life. So consider that. But if you'd like to talk about these things, I would be very eager and happy to be able to encourage and help you to think through them. So just get in touch. But I hope that's helpful. I hope that helps us to take these things more seriously and not fall into this hopeless, comfortless black hole of trusting in the scientists and physicians and psychologists to lead us out of this stuff. They're not going to get us out of these problems, and we have to learn to fight spiritual problems with spiritual remedies. I hope that's helpful. God bless.